Alright, well, it's better late than never. The Anandas arrived on my doorstep December 3rd, 2021, so I've had them in my possession quite a long while now. I just haven't gotten around to reviewing them. Things have gotten busy, delays, and so on. I did, however, start writing the review around that time, is when I promised the review. Didn't finish it until tonight, actually, so tonight's why we're getting around to it. This headphone originally released June 4th, 2018, so it's not necessarily a new headphone by any means. It's been out for a number of years. The market around this price category hasn't really shifted drastically enough to definitively say whether or not the Ananda is a bad option. I think this headphone still stands true in its position, and I think it still ranks very high, especially for the price. Depending on what price you can get it at, those prices would be. The original sale price for the Ananda was $999, believe it or not, that was the MSRP. But HiFiMan has since brought that down, thank God, to $699, which is still questionable. And I'd probably say no for that price if you're able to pick it up for $699. I personally got mine secondhand open box for $559. That, I would say, is an easy yes though, because that's, you know, almost $150 less than that $699, and that was questionable at that price even. But for $559, if you're able to get it open boxed secondhand, that is a definite yes, and I would go for that. But anyways, let's just jump into the sound, because that's what took so long. Alright, so top and low end extension. The sub bass extends well and remains present while not overwhelming the rest of the mix, while separated, textured, near equilibrium with where the rest of the mid-bass and mid-range frequencies reside, with only a few decibels of variation down to 40 Hz. The upper treble extends exceptionally, but is not overly airy or exaggerated. The same characteristic reigns true for most of the treble response. They exhibit very little in terms of peaks to the trained ear, but might sound a little hot at first pass to anyone stepping up from a darker tuning. And cymbal crashes, depending on intensity, can be a tad underwhelming with this set at times. For example, from the point of 40 seconds on into the song Now or Never by Godsmack, there's not a lot of weight behind the cymbals. This surprised me at first listen because that's not how I'm used to it playing back, and light use of this instrument can fare well, although heavier crashes tend to drag on an otherwise positive response. Treble is sharp and precise, but not too grainy or otherwise harsh. S's and T's aren't overbearing and not necessarily a concern here, though mostly good things. As for tonality, it's a fairly balanced response benefiting from its extension. It remains mostly neutral from 60 Hz onwards to 1K, with a light roll-off below 60 Hz, leading into lower treble above 1K. The Ananda inherits HiFiMan's typical late rise into the ear gain region, but this is barely anything to raise pitchforks over, as it doesn't really bring to light any particularly noteworthy detriment to the overall tonality. As for separation, the distinction between instruments is solid, but the distance between them is still apparent, and they appear better isolated in higher quality recordings, which is obviously not surprising. As for detail, it is tangible, focused, and satisfactory in supply. It won't leave you asking for much more, and there are some subtle nuances that they do pick up on quite well. Definitely not an in-your-face detail kind of headphone, but it is present, and I do think you're still getting what you pay for at this price point, despite there being a few sets that may otherwise stand in front a tad, so it's not a detail whore per se. As for the resolution and resolving ability, stepping up from a headphone like the HD58X from Sennheiser, which I have right here, there was instantly a grander sense of resolution. If that headphone was, forgive my metaphor, a 720p display, the Ananda is 1440p and what feels like at least be two sizable leaps above. As for imaging, it stands out wonderfully even across the center stage with very good lateral definition. I certainly don't think anyone will be disappointed with the imaging of this headphone, and it plays back remarkably well on tracks like Letter by Yoshi Horikawa. From the point of about 9 seconds onward, when the pencil hits the paper, you get a very clear sense of the locational data being presented, and I'm sure it woefully surprise any house guests you may lend the chance to try out the Ananda. For Soundstage, the Ananda is spacious when the music calls for it, but it's still within your grasp. It's a very honest representation of stage, and it's not in any way unnatural. Presentation also appears large in scale due to the sheer mass of the drivers and their open design complementing each other. I've forgotten I was wearing these on a couple occasions and mistaken them for my studio monitors for a brief period of time, about 30 seconds give or take. As for timbre, the Ananda is not as natural sounding as a dynamic headphone, but this is a definitive step forward from previous and earlier generation planar magnetics. It's not aggressively dry, but it's also not overly unnatural. And so as for Candor, which is the weight of the driver and excursion relative to sound, is rather polite for what it is. Being an 80 by 50mm driver, it's a lot less intimidating in practice than the numbers would have you believe. We can thank the weight of the driver itself for that, being that it's planar magnetic. Sounds come effortlessly with minimal excursion, and it's relatively easy to drive. At high gain with my SMSL SB200, I find myself barely pushing past 10 o'clock for a reasonable listening level. For that added punch. 3 o'clock seems to be its happy place. The Ananda stands very true in its Candor for these reasons, only losing points in its dynamic ability, which we are at now. It's not the most dynamic headphone in this category, the Ananda, but that's fairly typical for any planar. Most dynamic drivers in the high end will beat it out anyways, but it still does an exceptional job, and I certainly wouldn't dock it any points for not being the best because it has its place. There's a strong punch in the low end when given the proper power, but it misses out in the higher regions as stated. Although the typical planar magnetic sense of speed is obviously apparent, and that still does work in its favor. Alright, so conclusion. Buy, wait, don't buy. Like I said, the market isn't super crowded competitively, objectively speaking. I mean, subjectively, there's lots of headphones available, but if you're able to get this open box for, like I said, $559 like I did, I'd say it's still a very good recommendation. Even in 2022, going into 2023, this headphone is still an exceptional value for that price, and I would wholeheartedly recommend it. Hopefully this review was somewhat worth the wait. I mean, certainly made myself wait a very long time to put this out. I'm not going to say it was a very hard review to do. I just didn't sit down and write it like I should have, but I did. I finished it tonight, so here you go. That has been the Ananda review.